microbes have declared war on our existing stocks of antibiotics. It has been estimated that untreatable persistent infection will kill more than 10 million people around the globe every year by 2050. And this number will be larger than all combined deaths by cancer-related disease. There are a number of reasons for this and for the increase in the spread of antimicrobial resistance. Over time, there's been the overprescription, overconsumption and misuse of antibiotics in human health, and a general overuse in farming and agricultural practices. We've also helped the spread of this resistance through our advances in transportation and travel over the 20th century. Another major issue relates to our small pipeline of novel treatments, and as you can see here, there was a considerable gap in the release of classes of new antimicrobial compounds between 1960 and the year 2000. So it's of little surprise that the numbers of FDA approvals for new antimicrobials only resulted in 7 between 2000 and 2017. As of June this year, only 42 small molecular compounds are in clinical development as potential antimicrobials. And as we know, not all of these will make it to market, and those that do may take up to 20 years to be delivered. All the while, resistance takes, on average, only 8 years from the introduction of a new drug to the marketplace. So it's clear to say that we cannot solely rely on a pipeline of new treatments to address the antimicrobial resistance issue. One way we might use our existing antibiotic stocks differently rests with an idea known as collateral sensitivity. And this is the phenomenon that appears as a microbe becomes increasingly resistant to one drug, all the while becoming increasingly sensitive or susceptible to another antimicrobial. So how can this concept help, you might ask? Well, this could be used to provide clinicians with better informed drug treatment choices to help treat persistent infection. A recommendation could be formed in the framework of drug cycling, and as you can see here, drug A, for instance, followed by drug B, which would be seen to be collaterally sensitive to drug A, and then perhaps a return to drug A if that's proven to be collaterally sensitive to drug B in this situation, or a different drug altogether. This may provide current antibiotic stocks an extended shelf life and therefore a second wind, and this is where my research kicks in this year. My project this year has been to explore how a drug-resistant pathogen of interest here in New Zealand responds to other drugs, essentially identifying occurrences of collateral sensitivity and cross-resistance. Cross-resistance is where a microbe is already resistant to an antimicrobial and becomes increasingly tolerant to another one. So in my research, I wanted to investigate both types of response. And from that initial research, I looked to validate some of the interesting results achieved from the high throughput assays. So I chose Klebsiella pneumoniae, as this is a problematic pathogen here. It is an opportunistic one, and it's associated with hospital-acquired persistent infection. It appears post many simple and common medical procedures, such as catheter insertions, hip replacements, pacemaker insertions, and the like. Up to 15% of clinical blood isolates here in New Zealand have been found to contain beta-lactam-resistant strains of Klebsiella pneumoniae. Beta-lactam antibiotics is a large class of compounds and is commonly prescribed, and these include drugs like the penicillin group, ampicillin, penicillin, oxacillin, and cephalosporins such as ceftazidime. Back in 2018, a specific strain of Klebsiella pneumoniae was evolved to become highly resistant to ceftazidime, a beta-lactam antibiotic, and this was done in our MME lab. 15 independent lines of this strain were evolved towards greater resistance from exposure to higher concentrations of ceftazidime in each round of evolution. I chose 3 of these lines at random, and these formed the basis for my research this year. My first step was to confirm the level of ceftazidime resistance in all 3 lines, and those lines being A, L and O. No real surprises that in all lines I found substantial fold change increases in the amount of ceftazidime required to inhibit growth when compared to the original parent strain. The 3 lines returned minimum inhibitory concentrations between 500 and almost 1800 times that of the parent strain, providing evidence that these lines were indeed extremely resistant. My next step was to test the responses of these lines against multiple compounds of clinical relevance. The high throughput method I used was biolog phenotype microarray panels. These enabled me to test many compounds simultaneously. I used 3 panel varieties which represented a total of 72 compounds, 24 compounds on each plate, and each compound occupies 4 adjacent wells in increasing concentration. The red box simply points out to you that those 4 wells relate to one compound, being in this case ampicillin. Once the plates were inoculated and incubated, the wells would either remain clear or change to a shade of purple. A change to purple indicated the presence of cellular metabolism and therefore indicating growth and possibly cross-resistance. A clear well indicated no visible growth and possibly collateral sensitivity. In this example, this was taken from line A, round 9, and it shows how this ceftazidime resistant line responded to ampicillin, another beta-lactam antibiotic, indicating cross-resistance across all 4 concentrations. So for this part of my research, I used 36 of these microarray panels for all 3 lines, and another 3 for the original parent strain. And when I did the calculations, it worked out to be about 3,500 reactions that I needed to weigh up and wade through and review by the time we were finished. So turning it into something meaningful, what we did to transform these reactions into more meaningful comparisons was by adopting the same scoring methodology that was used in Elsie Dunkley's master's research of 2019. This is a scoring example from her work showing response scores for MRSA clinical isolate responses towards 3 different antibiotics. There's a maximum score capable across the 4 wells of 8, maximum per well of 2, 2 points indicative of growth, that being dark purple, 1 point for light purple or patchy, and 0 points for no visible growth detected. I then transformed these into a series of radar plots, which were grouped by class of compound, and this is the plot that I put together for the beta-lactam and cyclic non-ribosomal polypeptide groups, which included penicillins, cephalosporins, and polymyxins. On the outside of the ring is the score of 8, and a score of 0 would be shown in the centre. If any of our experimental lines scored lower than the parent strain, and therefore the lines show closer to the centre than the parent line, then this would be an indication of possible collateral sensitivity to that compound. As you can see on the right hand side here, whoops, sorry, laser pointer, where are you? I had you there. So on the right hand side here is the group of penicillins, which is showing an overall increase in resistance. But then if I also point in and show you polymyxin B and colistin, these are showing increased sensitivity. So the experimental lines showed overall increased sensitivity towards those compounds. Another radar plot example relates to the aminoglycosides. In general, 2 out of 3 experimental lines showed increased sensitivities to a number of these compounds. However, noteworthy is capreomycin in the top right, where every line tested and showed heightened sensitivity to that drug. Then I wanted to have a look at how the collateral sensitivity and cross-resistance incidence were shared between lines. Overall, I found that there was an increased sensitivity towards 8 of the 72 compounds, which represents about 11%. A further 4 shared increases in sensitivity between 2 lines. From these, I chose capreomycin and erythromycin to have a closer look at and to validate these findings. On the cross-resistance side of it, 14 compounds indicated cross-resistance across all 3 experimental lines, which represented about 20% of the compounds that we tested. From this group, I had easy access with time constraints to oxacillin, so I chose oxacillin to add it to the potentially collateral sensitive capreomycin and erythromycin for further validation. And so this is the experiment that I conducted, minimum inhibitory concentrations, to identify the minimum amounts of drug required for inhibition of microbial growth. Yellow columns on here are the parent strain. I was able to validate this with testing how much drug would be needed. Oxacillin compared to the parent strain, all 3 experimental lines showed that we required 512 megs per litre to inhibit growth compared to the parent at 128. And I was also able to validate collateral sensitivity to capreomycin and erythromycin. Erythromycin 256 megs per litre compared to 128 for the parent line, and capreomycin at around 130 megs per litre where for the parent strain, and then under 100 megs per litre for the experimental lines tested. What we might draw from these initial observations is that the collateral sensitivity I found appears to be compound specific, which was also one suggestion that I found in an E. coli research paper published back in 2013. Cross-resistance was more widespread in general and could possibly be more of a class phenomenon rather than a compound-specific phenomenon. The next steps are likely to include clinical isolate testing of beta-lactam-resistant strains of Klebsiella pneumoniae to see if the results match up to these in vitro ones. There's also quite a number of individual response variabilities between certain lines that require further investigation so that we can understand specific mechanisms of resistance. In conclusion, it became clear that there were really no particular patterns at this point that could explain collateral sensitivity or cross-resistance. However, albeit small, there is potentially a level of predictability that may be able to be directly applied in future towards practical drug recommendations for existing antibiotics. And on that note, I'd really like to thank Wayne for your support this year. Monica, thank you for your feedback, and the members of the MME Lab group. I couldn't do it without you. Special thanks to Elsie, Monica, and Katie. Thank you.
Yeah, that was a great talk. I was just curious, are you going to sequence the 3 strains to sort of see how they're...
We were really hoping to, but it was just a matter of timing. We ran out of time. And this honours project has been pretty intense with the amount of review of data, but definitely would be something that would be worth looking at. Yeah.
That was a really nice talk. Before you showed your last slide, I was going to ask you if there are any similarities between the compounds that show cross-reactivity or collateral sensitivity across all your experimental lines. And you did allude to in the final slide that there was some predictability to it. Could you expand a little bit more on that?
Yeah, the predictability relates to those compounds where we found a very similar result across all 3 experimental lines. And those windows are quite narrow when you think you have 3 lines that you're testing and you find that these compounds respond the same way, and then when you look at it at the end, it works out to be 11%. But that's 11% of something rather than nothing at all. And I I think with further testing and looking at specific mechanisms of resistance, we would definitely be able to identify more closely what specifically is driving that result.
Is antibiotic something, has that actually been used in practice in the clinic? And
It has. The one, yes it has. However, not necessarily molecularly defined as the right practice.
sure.
Because we
Yeah,
find...
actually on that note, the rest of my question is going to be, could you sort of suggest how your results might inform
We've got 3 drugs there that we could take to in vivo testing now, I think. That's my opinion. And I wanted to answer the first part of your question
Sure,
first. Is
yeah,
that okay?
yeah.
What we found is that cross-resistance occurs more often than collateral sensitivity. If a doctor right now is prescribing a second drug, they're doing that without an understanding of what that might be doing to the condition for the patient. And so if there is a scenario where they're extending drug resistance through recommending the wrong drug, then that could potentially be an issue. I think what we're trying to do is find those mechanisms that inform about the right combination or the most likely combination that would help to treat that really persistent infection. Because we're not talking about a simple infection, we're talking about something which is not able to be cured by the first drug. Yeah.
But ruling out the wrong combination sounds like a really good first step.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks very much.